handle the truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman, Seat, over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder, Seat, out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Grid to suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 tree 5, 9er 2-1. Grid to mark, Mike Charlie, 4-7 tree 9er, 8-9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds AGPT, gas TOT 5-3.
And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. We have the holidays coming up, and there is a fabulous, fabulous book that has got to be on your list. Well, lots of people's lists, I would say. The Hidden Nazi. And I have the distinct pleasure of having Dean Reuter with us, who is one of the co-writers of the book. They've done a real public service for us because they're filling in some history gaps. And telling the rest of the story, I think, is the better way of saying it. But the book is about one particular Nazi that just sort of vanished, and then he did, and then he didn't, and then he did. Dean, welcome to the Denise Simon Experience.
Thank you so much for having me on. I've been looking forward to this. I appreciate your time.
Well, congratulations on this book. I'm going to throw your publisher sent me a bunch of questions, and I look at them, but I generally don't use them. So I'm going to start off this way. Simon Wiesenthal was one of the more famous Nazi hunters, and he's now passed on. Yeah. Did somebody pick up, and I haven't really looked at this, but did somebody kind of, other than you, pick up the baton and continue the work that his Wiesenthal Center was doing?
Well, that's a great question. So there are several entities that have spent significant amounts of time hunting Nazis, quote unquote. One is the Wiesenthal Center. That's a private concern. Another here in the United States is the Department of Justice Office of Special Investigation. Another is the Mossad in Israel. And each of the Western European countries have their own Nazi hunting groups. I'm tempted to say they've slowed down.
Yes.
But some of that really is because of the age of some of the greatest offenders. The war ended 74 years ago this year. So you can do the math in your head. If you had any seniority at all, as the subject of our book, The Hidden Nazi, was very senior. So he would be 118 now. Had he survived. So the folks that are left to find and prosecute are basically very young camp guards and other people that were young at the time. In fact, just 2 weeks ago, the trial of a camp guard began in Hamburg, Germany. A guy named Bruno Day, who was a guard at a camp that Hans Kammler built. Kammler is the subject of our story, of our hunt in The Hidden Nazi. And this Bruno Day served at a camp that Kammler built. He built the camp, he built the gas chambers, he built the ovens at the camp. And this guy now is on trial, but he was 17 years old at the time the war ended, 18 at the time the war ended. So he's being actually tried in juvenile court, oddly. But that's what's left in terms of Nazis to find. The very, very, and he's 93. So the math is working in the favor of the Nazis, I'd say.
I would say, but yet we kind of want to know where these people ended up. We need to be closing some books here. I mean, certainly some of them could be dead, and likely are. Most of them, I would argue, if not. Yeah. But we kind of need to close some chapters here, don't we?
I couldn't agree with you more, and that's one of the reasons we wrote The Hidden Nazi, because that's one of the reasons I did. I have two co-authors and researchers, but I was the principal author, and to me, World War II and the Holocaust are stories that just need retelling. I mean, my kids are adults, 23, 26. But the understanding of folks under 30 and under 20 of World War II, but especially the Holocaust, that it's not that they disbelieve it, it just hasn't been starkly presented to them. And it's a story that you have to keep revisiting. Otherwise, you can't forget something you've never learned before. But if you haven't learned it, I really do believe history could repeat itself. And you need to learn the lessons of history. And that's one of the motivations in telling the story of the hidden Nazi.
Dean, you've got, I did a fast calculation, about 65 pages of citations in this. So that tells me, single-spaced, I might add, and probably an 8-point font, that tells me that there was an awful lot of legwork, an awful lot of reading transcripts and testimonies and looking through files and whatnot. Did you kind of have to go from U.S. Archives, the Department of Justice, to Germany, to Britain, to even, CIA?
Yeah, one of our researchers is here in the United States. One's in Northern Ireland. He took care of all the European stuff, but I did travel to Europe. It's a combination of going to archives, but also obscure libraries have documents that you wouldn't think of. Military bases have caches of documents, and then it's a matter of requesting documents not just from the Justice Department, but from the FBI, from the Army, the Navy, everywhere, and then all over Europe. And one part of the book, The Hidden Nazi, is what we discovered is this really wicked, really powerful general supposedly committed suicide at the end of the war. We found out he didn't commit suicide, and there was a cover-up.
Imagine that.
Yeah, there was a cover-up, so that makes the documents particularly difficult to pry loose because of the cover-up. So, but there was a tremendous amount of legwork. We estimated maybe 30,000 hours of time in terms of research and this is over a period of literally 15, 20 years for 3 different people. So,
were you specifically looking for Mr. Hans Kammler, or were you looking for something else and then this one jumped off the page?
That's a great question. I mean, one of my co-authors, Keith Chester, had done a World War II book on a narrow subject, and he encountered Hans Kammler in his research. And he came to learn the story of this guy who was in charge of the concentration camps, building the concentration camps, then in charge of all of Germany's secret weapons. This vast cache of highly technical weapons that everybody wanted at the end of the war. And then this unsatisfactory story of his death, which never sat right with Keith Chester. So he started researching him. He found this other researcher in Northern Ireland. And I got involved as a lawyer writing an agreement between the two of them so they could share their research. And then bit by bit by bit, I got more involved in the project. They kept sending me documents, which I couldn't believe, really. I couldn't believe there was a story this big and this important that hadn't been told yet. But we just,
and what's really fascinating about this kind of work, Dean, is that, what was it, about 2 years ago, we actually found a Nazi in New York and deported him?
Yes, I mean these stories are current day.
Yes,
I found some of these characters who lived into the 2000s, well into the 2000s. We're still deporting people every once in a while. In 2013, somebody died in an apartment in Munich. He turned out to be the son of one of Goebbels' art collectors.
Yeah, I read that too.
And he had 2 different places, his apartment in Munich and another apartment in which he had $1 billion worth of art. Yeah, $1 billion worth of art. And everybody thinks, everything's been returned or, accounts have been settled. There was a commission we found that was an international commission charged with finding, locating, and returning gold that was seized by the Nazis. And that worked until about 1996 is when they finally shut that down. The ripples and repercussions of World War II are ongoing. And as proof of that, the subject of the hidden Nazi is Hans Kammler. He designed the concentration camps, and I went and I interviewed somebody that survived 2 of his camps. So his victims are still around, even if he's not. So the story is vastly important, I think.
Well, there's some good TV shows that are out there that are still trying to tell the story, but it's so happenstance because there's so many avenues, there's so many lanes to all of this.
Yes.
That trying to put the bigger picture together whether it's Austria, whether it's Argentina, whether it's Uruguay, whether it's Switzerland, still finding and rejoining lost art with the rightful owners.
Mm-hmm.
It had to be a little bit of a challenge for you and your co-authors, Dean, to kind of stay focused here, to keep the lane narrow, correct?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. You mentioned the 65 pages of notes. The book itself, I think it reads well. I think it's a fast read for people. It's a good pace. It reads like a mystery, like almost like a nonfiction, people have said, and I agree with that. But the first draft was about 200%. It was about double what it was, and I had to start cutting because I didn't want it to be a textbook length. I wanted it to be a page turner. But you're absolutely right. It was a challenge to stay focused and not to run down too many different rabbit holes, because World War II, as you know, it was probably the largest, most significant undertaking in human history. It involved more people and more effort than anything else in the history of the world.
Who didn't cooperate? Were there people that were like, no, and then just kind of slammed the door and put down the phone and said, forget about it, I'm not going to cooperate?
In terms of our research efforts?
Yeah.
Well, I interviewed this general's son, and I would say he cooperated, but he was cagey.
Uh-huh.
It's clear he didn't want to disclose too much information, and he wanted to try to get information from me. He wanted to know if I had proof that his father had survived. We had a document request for a couple documents that were completely denied by the federal government. Usually they'll give you a redacted version, but these were documents that concerned Hans Kammler, written in 1969 and 1987. 40 years after he's supposedly dead, and they've got documents that they won't produce that are about this general who's supposedly dead. And then we had some resistance from other governments too.
Why do you think that was denied? Is it because some of those technologies were applied here?
I don't think it's about the technologies. I think it was about what ultimately happened to him. He did not die at the end of the war. He actually surrendered to the U.S. Army, and his record was so terrible, we didn't want to acknowledge we had custody of him. We didn't want to acknowledge we had done a deal. But our book shows, The Hidden Nazi shows, that he turned over valuable technology to the Americans in exchange for his life. And that's something that we weren't really proud of. We didn't run from it, but we didn't want it discussed. So we just buried the records. And I think some of those records remain buried.
Isn't there a rule or a law that after 50 years they have to be declassified, or am I overstepping it?
Well, there was it's not that definitive. There was an international working group in the early 2000s that tried to speed the declassification of records, and they got to a lot of them, but not to all of them, clearly, as these two records prove. There were records that we got from the 1950s, 1940s during the war that are heavily redacted. They have things that are missing. They're
fascinating.
Yeah, and of course, that means the 50-year record, 50-year rule is not a thing, or it's not observed, I would say.
So this all means at some point, I guess you'll have to kind of keep at it, and then you'll have to write version 2 to the book.
I think there might be a sequel in mind. I mean, I think the book stands alone. It reads well. It comes to a conclusion. But I really do hope that this book becomes popular enough that people are reading it and they remember, it's like, my grandfather said something about some guy named Kammler.
Yeah.
And somebody finds a box of documents in their attic or in their basement or something like that. And everybody gets involved in the chase for the hidden Nazi.
So many people came back from World War II, and, whether you were Army or Marines or whatever it may be, and it was kind of like there were so many that went and fought that everybody had something in common, and there wasn't really any point talking about it. So when they came back to the United States, started to build their second life, GI Bill and all these other they just didn't talk about things anymore. They just kind of stored things, and that was it. And they're leaving it to the next generation to kind of uncover some of these things. So there's stories out there that you, Dean, are I think still seeking, and they need to be told.
I agree, and you're right about the attitude at the end of the war. It's like, let's put it behind us. The war ends. It was like everybody put everything in boxes, and they all just came home. There were some things that were so horrible nobody would want to talk about them. And then there's things that are just sort of benign reasons not to just keep reliving that part of the past, to move on. And the records, we've been very slow to digitize the records.
Yes.
We did find there were two agencies we think were specifically involved in the cover-up of the hidden Nazi. And for one of them, there are 5 million pages of missing records. And for the other, there are 2 years of missing records for the most important aspect of that agency, and that's 1945 to 1947. So, you're left to draw your own conclusions in some instances. But the records are in very poor shape, I would say, especially with regard to Hans Kammler, the hidden Nazi.
Well, even the records that we have found out when we were searching for these U-2 submarines that were in American waters. I mean, some of those records are so wrong, and there's a lot of people that are doing civilian-type investigations on them, but... Let's talk about
in the hidden Nazi. We do, since you mentioned submarines, we do mention at length one submarine, the U-234, which surrendered to the U.S. after the end of the war. It was packed with technology, jet fighters, rocket parts, things that we think our target, Hans Kammler, loaded onto that submarine and shipped to the United States as part of his deal to save his own life.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Which, good segue, because I was going to ask about the V-2.
The V-2 is one of the vengeance weapons. These are highly sophisticated rockets that the Germans developed. They started developing rockets in the 1930s, early 1930s. The war didn't start until 1939, so they had an 8-year head start to try and develop these rockets. The V-2 itself was a supersonic, liquid-fueled rocket, way ahead of its time. It was as if it didn't belong on the same battlefield in World War II. Our scientists, the Western Allies scientists, thought it could not be built. They didn't think you could build a liquid fuel rocket. It wasn't physically possible to make a liquid fuel rocket, but it was 44 feet high, flew at 3,600 miles an hour, and it would blow up before you could hear it. It was, it exceeded the speed of sound by about 5 times. So you'd be walking down the street and a city block would blow up in London or Southampton or Antwerp. And they could travel about 200 miles. And they were accurate enough to target a city. They were revolutionary. Everybody wanted them at the end of the war. Everybody knew Germany was losing the war, and there would be this mad scramble for this rocket team that was able to produce these rockets. And it's the thesis of the book that Kammler moved the rocket team twice to keep them out of the hands of the Soviets and deliver them to the U.S. Army. That's how we got Wernher von Braun. That's how we got the rocket team. That's how we got to the moon before the Russians did. And that's how we got our ICBM that helped us win the Cold War. So it was a hugely consequential thing.
Which, in some cases, I think the United States was almost embarrassed that we weren't nearly as advanced as, Nazi Germany was in the late 30s, early 40s, right?
Yeah, and we had this political perspective that we were still going to mind our own business. We were not going to be interventionists. We were stay-at-home sort of country. And if that's your attitude, you don't have to have a lot of weaponry. But you don't always get to pick the wars you want to be in. When you're attacked by the Japanese at Pearl Harbor, and then Germany declared war on us, it's like you're at war, whether you want to be or not. And then you spend a lot of time trying to catch up in terms of your own technology and your industrialization. If you don't have a large standing army and navy and air force. Fortunately, America was able to turn its industrial capacity into a war-making capacity. There's a friend of mine, Arthur Herman, wrote a great book called Freedom's Forge, which focuses on the conversion of America's industry into a wartime economy in the run-up to World War II.
So once we discovered that Germany had these things and a lot of its technology was surrendered to the United States had a tough decision to make. We hear about this military-industrial complex, blah, 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 but we didn't have a choice. We had to launch a military-industrial complex in order to ensure that we would seize the moment here of things like the technologies of the V2 and other weaponry, because we had the Soviets to worry about next, correct?
That's exactly right. You're spot on there. The Soviets were going to be the existential threat. Germany and America, they were enemies, certainly, but Germany never wanted to conquer the United States. They didn't have an ideology that was at odds with the U.S. In fact, Hitler viewed the United States as a post-war power. The Soviet Union had been mortal enemies, existential threat to the United States. And as the war was ending, everybody knew those were going to be the battle lines. It'd be the U.S. and the Western Allies against the Soviet Union. That's why we made the deal with Kammler. And we described that in The Hidden Nazi in the book.
How much record correcting did you and your team do, if at all, going through the research to write the book?
I think a lot. I mean, The Hidden Nazi not only retells the story, it tells the story of Kammler. There's no record there. So,
right.
I mean, there is a record in terms of him being dead, quote unquote. We corrected that record. But we also correct the record about some of what we thought, what conventional history thinks about art and treasure, about the Fourth Reich, and about the extent of Germany's nuclear research. I think we got that wrong. We explore a rocket that nobody's really talked about. It's been talked about. I shouldn't say that we broke news with it, but we've spread the word a lot further about this rocket that was designed to fly from Europe to the United States. That's a rocket that was developed by Wernher von Braun, who became an American hero. So in a way, we sort of rewrite the history on Wernher von Braun. He was not as squeaky clean as everybody thought.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm glad, don't get me wrong, I'm glad we made the deal with Kammler in The Hidden Nazi. I'm glad we got the rocket team and won the Cold War. I think the world would look a lot differently if we hadn't gotten them. But I think we set the record straight on a lot of different threads of history.
Quickly, I know that you went through some of the Nuremberg documents. Did you end up being angry at some of the things that were missing or not part of the Nuremberg trials?
Well, yeah. I mean, the Nuremberg trials basically went after the highest-ranking Nazis. One of the things that was really disappointing was the number of people that never got tried.
Yes.
They never faced justice, including the hidden Nazi, Hans Kammler. He never faced justice, and he made the Holocaust possible. He was a despicable human being. But it turns out that, as we wanted to recruit Nazis to help fight the war, the ones we wanted to recruit were the ones that were most culpable, usually. They were the ones that were in the powerful position. It's ironic, but it was true, and it's very discouraging, but in some ways understandable.
Ladies and gentlemen, if you don't do anything else, we've got the holidays coming up. Instead of watching the Detroit Lions on Thanksgiving Day after the turkey, if you can stay awake, grab this book, The Hidden Nazi. I think you could almost put some excerpts out there at the dinner table on Thanksgiving and just say, "Did you know?" And then really have a very non-political type conversation, which always seems to be the problem. But congratulations on this.
Thank you, and you're exactly right. This would give people something to talk about that's not controversial. Nobody's a fan of the Nazis. So.
Right, exactly right. I bet you're going to have a lot of people tapping you on the shoulder and wanting to ask you a whole pile of questions. And with 65 pages of citations, I would say that you probably got the answers at your fingertips. Ladies and gentlemen, The Hidden Nazi, the Holocaust engineer exposed 70 years later, Mr. Hans Kammler. Thank you, Dean Reuter, for being so open and generous with all your work, and congratulations on this. I'm going to tap you on the shoulder, I think, in a couple of months to see how it has been received worldwide, and I say worldwide purposely because I think it is fascinating. So, Mr. Dean, thank you very much for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way. We're heard worldwide on Mojo 50. Stay with us. Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. I have a breathless guest with us now because he's been dropping cars off and he's been running around trying to find buildings that he can go in and find a room it's got good acoustics so he could share some time with us. And he's actually a previous guest. I have John Tamny with us, a successful author. He's the managing editor of A Real Clear Markets. He's a speechwriter. He's the director of our economic freedom at Freedom Works. I mean, he's just everywhere. Just everywhere. And we're going to talk about the fact that both parties are getting it wrong. So, John, just breathe deeply and welcome back to the Denise Simon Experience.
Yeah, just welcome Superman on. How about that?
Oh, Lord. When things can go wrong, they do. And we don't anticipate them. I'm going to throw you a curveball for your first question here because it was, I think, last week that Congresswoman Ilhan Omar was at some event in Minnesota, and she was railing against the United States being an imperialist power. I think she got a little tiny bit of that right because I think we have in some cases an imperialist government when it comes to hurting our freedoms. Is that overstating it, or am I giving her too much credit that she doesn't deserve?
Yeah, no, I like the way you put it. I don't think we're intentionally an imperialist power, but I think sometimes our actions, whereby we're trying to save so much of the world, would create that impression. And I don't know where you stand on this, but I tend to agree that I think you and I would both say that government is prone to egregious mistakes domestically.
Yes.
And my argument's always been that the fallibility of government officials doesn't stop at our borders. It tends to happen overseas too. And so in my ideal world, we would have an incredibly strong military defending the United States and doing very little else. The military would still be a massive bureaucracy prone to inefficiency and all sorts of things, but we could limit the mistakes that end up leading to loss of lives and limb and all that. So I probably agree in a weird way with the representative.
Yeah, that's kind of where I was going. Not so much that I agree with her that we're an imperialist power globally, but I would say an imperialist government when it comes to stepping on our freedoms here at home.
Yeah. How do I put it? I've always argued on TV that you can't be for limited government while cheering on a military that has bases in just about every country. You're either for limited government or you're not, and I'm not anti-military. I greatly respect ours. I think it's interesting, however, that Ron Paul, back when he ran for president the last time, he got more donations for military families than anyone else by far. Mm-hmm. I think within the military, there is a great deal of skepticism about the U.S. as the policeman, and so there's so much I would disagree with Omar on, but this is one where again, if we're for limited government, we've got to be consistent.
Okay. Am
I crazy?
No, I mean, I think there's something to that. I mean, we have to go do some crazy things militarily when all else fails. And I think sometimes when all else fails, we end up giving up too much, too. So it's really kind of a double-edged sword there. But, yeah, I mean, we could probably go on about that one for a very long time. Now, Trump's, we hear Trump's stump speeches when he's out there. I think he's headed to yet someplace else. I think every other day he's going to be pretty busy, on Air Force One landing someplace to help somebody win a political seat. But, John, something tells me that his speeches are getting a little bit tired. I think he needs to kind of change gears a little bit. And I would say there are two things that he's missing in his stump speeches that need to be injected. And that is, we kind of need to go back to a law and order agenda. he came out with that at one point, and he's kind of left that one alone. And then a message of self-reliance, that we're trying to get out of the way so people can be self-reliant. Am I off base on that one, John?
No, I don't think you're off base at all. Now, where I might quibble a little is I think law and order, like most things, should be more of a local thing. What I think the founders were onto something. They were the first people to be skeptical about government. Mm-hmm. And they basically said that the Constitution exists not to limit your rights, but protect you from politicians that would tend to steal your freedoms. That this is about protecting your rights, and that gets into the self-reliance. Isn't it interesting in the Constitution that there's never a mention of democracy? The founders were deeply skeptical about democracy. Their idea was that we would have a republic with severely limited powers so that people could choose what they wanted locally. And there's also nothing about economic growth. There's nothing about feeling good. There's nothing about good health. You're guaranteed nothing. People were not coming to the United States because it offered security in any way. What it offered was freedom. It offered freedom economically, freedom individually to do as you wish, so long as you're not harming one another. And I think that's what Trump should be talking about, the self-reliance that you described.
Yes.
That we exist to protect your rights to flourish as you wish. And for everyone, that's going to be a different thing. Everyone's got different ambitions, values. That's what we're here to do, nothing else. And if you expect something more, you're expecting something that's your expectations aren't in keeping with what makes the U.S. the greatest country on earth.
Good segue, because now I'm going to go to I think Trump came out with something regarding regulations. We get rid of 3 and you can put 1 in. And I think there was some good traction on that for a while. And all of a sudden that whole kind of mission looks like it slowed down or went away. Government regulations to me inhibits self-reliance, not only on a personal basis, but even on a professional basis and in a job related. Is that true? And if so, beyond regulations, what else is in the way?
Well, of course it's true what you say. In thinking about regulation, what we have to think about, it's the equivalent with regulation. It's the equivalent of someone you keep telling, we're not going to hire you. You don't fit our plans. And they show up anyway to work one day, and they say, not only am I part of your plans, I'm going to dictate much of what you do. You're going to have to run by me what you choose to do and how you run your business. And so you're asking very people with regulation who could never get jobs in the industries they presume to regulate to, in fact, regulate them. And so as a rule, they fail. Citigroup had no less than 60 full-time regulators in the building back in 2008. They didn't have a clue about the problems within the bank. It was about to go under yet again. But the fact that they didn't is no surprise. If you could see into the future and detect trouble spots, which is what we're asking the regulators to do, you wouldn't be a regulator. You'd be earning billions as an investor. So the very notion of regulation is failed, and then it becomes expensive, needlessly burdensome, and it gets us nowhere.
Regulations, there's a thin line between regulations and law, right?
Gosh, I almost prefer law, because law is law. Regulation is the whim of, again, these people who aren't qualified to work in your business, but presume to tell you how to run your business. Law, at least theoretically, is something, okay, we know what it is, and so we can deal with it based on it being law. Regulation, my goodness.
If I was to ask you, industry associations, I mean, you got the retail association, you got a whole bunch of oil associations and whatnot. Are those individual industries able to self-regulate without interference from government and do it rightly so?
Oh, without question.
Okay.
What's the ultimate regulation? It's called competition.
Thank you. That's where I was going. That's why.
Yeah. Well, we think alike. Any business exists not to get your business one time, but to get a customer that keeps coming back. and this business is seeking a repeat customer in a world in which there are others who want that same customer to be their own repeat. And so the regulation is already in existence, and it's the ultimate kind because you have to keep proving yourself against competition that desperately wants to expand its market share on your back. And so regulations from government are superfluous. And again, they're worse than superfluous because you're asking the unqualified to actually have good ideas for how you should prosper. It's the most perverse thing. And I don't think our side is critical of it enough.
Well, and I come from the telecommunications industry, and there's an awful lot of competition that goes on in the telecom industry, especially in the cellular world. They're all offering something. But the same thing, goes on, I would say, in the oil business. I would say that the one place that I think that we need it, but then again, it's government it's really a government entity, is education. But there are private schools that are competing with public schools. So there is some competition there, correct?
Oh, yeah, of course there's competition. And there's also competition in the sense that people move around to find the best regulation. But, I think, so you're from telecom, so you know this better than most. What made the cellular industry great was people from outside of it. The father, I would argue, tell me if I'm wrong, of the modern cellular industry is Craig McCaw, this visionary from the cable world who saw potential where very few saw it. Remember, he bought MCI's mobile communications business for a song because most people thought this wasn't going to be a big industry. Because remember, the original mobile phones cost $4,000.
I remember. I bought one.
Yeah. So, think about this. You were one of the few that could afford one of these because when I was growing up, you'd see someone with one of these brick-sized phones. I grew up in Southern California, and so movie stars had them. And so when you'd see someone, you'd stop and look over and peek and pretend like you're, as in, who is this? Who's this big movie star? Who's this big movie producer? Cellular was this thing for the richest of the rich, the very, very few. And so here Craig McCaw thought that it could be an industry that's met the needs of millions and millions of people around the country, which it now does. And so the regulators, if they had overseen its development, what a disaster that would have been. Think how much slower we would have gotten to where we are today.
Well, the same thing necessarily happened when Mr. Hayes invented the modem. He happened to work at the same company I did at the time. And everybody said, why do you need to mass produce these modems? Well, because we're going to put computers in everybody's home. Well, no, you're not. I mean, that's just nobody's going to want to use those. And here we are today. We don't even really have computers anymore. We're down to tablets. So, and they're pretty powerful, I would argue. So, what I'm really getting at here is there's an awful lot of innovation out there that we're not really keeping pace with, and as far as the news goes. But if government would stay out of the way, I would argue there'd be a freight train of innovation that's out there. Agreed?
Without question, there would be. It would just be that much quicker. Imagine, what does the government spend on an annual basis? $5 trillion. To me, that's $5 trillion that would remain in the private sector if government were smaller, that would be spent on all sorts of experimentation. And so what people forget is when government offers us good things, it can only offer us inefficiently what's already known. The private sector keeps creating things we didn't know that we need, but we can't live without now. Were you demanding Amazon? Were you demanding Amazon before it came about? Were you demanding Uber? Were you demanding these supercomputers that sit in our pocket? Remember, the deal with cellular communications is everyone wanted these teeny tiny phones. Oh, that was sleek. That was elite. Steve Jobs comes along and says, wait a second, I'm going to put a computer in your pocket that you could basically live your life on. And so if government's overseeing it, as a rule, they're going to be talking about delivering us poorly what was in the past. The private sector delivers to us what we never knew we wanted, but that we soon enough can't live without.
And I would say that it's increased human production. It has made things a lot faster, Which, too, is also a double-edged sword, because I think there's a lot of stress that goes with the speed with which we live today. But, I mean, this just goes along with it. How much have you been watching these Democrat candidates for vying on the 2020 election?
As little as possible. No, I watch them. It's disturbing. I don't like politicians as a rule. I'm unhappy watching Republicans when they're running for president too. I just think what they feel they must say to win votes is generally very bothersome, and it's very bothersome watching Elizabeth Warren and some of these others.
Well, you mentioned Elizabeth Warren. Is she one of the ones, if we were going to have a televised debate, prime time, with John Tamny, which candidate would you like to debate most?
Oh, I'd love to debate her. She would be fun. Bernie Sanders would be too easy. I want to debate Elizabeth Warren because she's got a plan for everything, and that's the problem. I want to talk about her plans because, see, I don't know. Everything that I enjoy today, I, once again, didn't know that I wanted. I had no idea that Uber would ever exist. I never imagined Amazon. The idea that you could have the world's plenty show up on your doorstep within 24 hours and sometimes within 20 minutes just never occurred to me. You see, when I was growing up, remember those television ads in the 70s that said, please allow 6 weeks for delivery? Remember, so much was not available in stores, and please allow 6 weeks. And so capitalists keep getting me things that in amazing ways. And so when politicians say I've got a plan for that, my rule is I don't have a plan for anything because, see, again, I don't know why I have a supercomputer in my pocket, but I do. And so I want to see what these people who don't have plans, who are not being controlled by politicians, what they can create for us in the future.
There's one thing, John, that bothers me, and that is that we've had generations and generations of government that should be getting things right, to the point where government should be such a finely tuned machine, such a well-oiled machine, that we don't have to keep fixing it. But yet we have to keep fixing it, or we're concocting a crisis or something that we have to go fix. And I would argue we're kind of going backwards. So the premise that you say that both parties are getting it wrong, I absolutely agree. I would think that the conservatives or the Republicans or the libertarians would be saying, you know what, after all these years, we don't need the Department of Education anymore. After all these years, we can turn the Department of Energy over to the oil associations, the oil organizations and institutes. So how come we're still getting all these things wrong?
Well, we're getting all these things wrong because you don't get into politics because you want to make things right. Think about it. Let's say you and I were made dictator. They said that John and Denise can kind of run the show. Well, so I'm guessing, among other things, we would agree to greatly reduced federal taxes, and I would, look, I'd like to do a head tax, but let's just say we would switch it back to some kind of very small consumption tax, and none of these, we'd erase all the rest of the taxes. We would get rid of all these regulations. There's all these things we would do because we agree that competition is the ultimate regulation. We think people are overtaxed. We'd want a stable dollar. But remember, if you're getting into politics, you need to be able to make money once you're not in politics. As in, you want a cushy retirement just like everyone else does. Well, so if suddenly you shrink the role of government in taxation and regulation, in trade and all these things, suddenly you have no purpose once you're no longer in politics. Furthermore, no one has to pay you big money to lobby Washington, because what would there be to lobby? If they weren't doing anything, there would not be, all these businesses wouldn't have huge offices in Washington that exist to move legislation. So politicians, the incentive for them is to make things worse, to make things more complicated, because see, if they don't have a job. They make a lot of money once they're out of politics, and they're speaking around the world, and they're hired by the top lobbying firms and make enormous sums because they can influence things. sometimes for the better. There's no doubt about that. But pure simplification they would never do, because that means their retirement, their work post politics would be very, very limited.
All right, you're going to have a show and tell opportunity because you have been invited to speak at an economics class at a university. Standing in the front of the class, what is going to be your presentation to the students in an auditorium style with about 400 of them?
It would be very basic. I would begin with the most important line ever written in any economics book ever written. Sadly, it's not by me. It's written by Henry Hazlitt. He wrote, quote, "What is harmful or disastrous to the individual must be equally harmful or disastrous to the collection of individuals that make up a nation," end quote. Now, what Hazlitt was saying is that an economy is not a living, breathing blob. It's just individuals. And once you understand that an economy is just individuals, you can then see how blindingly simple is economics. Because I don't care if you're Republican, Democrat, libertarian, anarchist, communist, socialist. What you cannot deny is that on an individual basis, no individual is improved economically if more and more of the dollars earned are being taken away in taxes. No individual is able to create more wealth if more and more of the hours spent at work are spent complying with regulations. No individual is improved economically if the dollars earned are constantly being devalued by the U.S. Treasury. And no individual is able to get more things, which is the purpose of our work. We're working in order to import. No individual is able to import to increase his wealth if more and more people from around the world are barred from serving that individual's needs solely because they live in another country. And so once you see, having understood that the individual is what drives economic growth, you understand all that you'll ever need to know about economics. Just reduce those four barriers, the tax, regulatory, trade, and monetary barriers to production, and you will have endless prosperity. It's really all very simple. That economics as a course is an offense to common sense. If you can't understand why human beings do things, I can't help you. But you and I understand that this is very basic. We know what helps, what makes Denise and Simon better off, what makes John Tamny better off. Just less people reaching into our pockets, fewer people wrecking the money we earn, fewer people getting in the way of our ability to import from others, whether they're in China or Russia or Saudi Arabia or Nicaragua or Canada or from across the street. Just leave us alone.
Well, that we have the millennials, lots of them, and we have the Gen X population that are railing against capitalism. And yet they pay for capitalism every single day. Having said that, several years ago, we had something called the Occupy Wall Street movement, which I think that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have turned into an art form now with policy. So they're making Occupy Wall Street part of a art form, a policy art form. Is that overstating it?
No, I don't think it's overstated at all. Let me just say to you that if you and I were dictators, I think that our policies of economic growth would be so successful that we would create hundreds of AOCs and hundreds of Bernie Sanders. I think that AOC and Bernie and Elizabeth Warren are a creation of the wealth they claim to despise. You can't demagogue wealth if there's none of it. And so if you and I were running the show, there'd be a lot more wealth, and there'd be a lot more of these people making careers out of their ability to do it. As far as young kids, that's what they always say about every generation. They said it about your generation, my generation, your parents' generation, your grandparents' generation. Every generation that's younger looks spoiled and entitled, and what that is just a sign of progress. We move so fast, life gets so unrelentingly better all the time that it seems like these young people just have it so easy, and that's just wrong. But they said it about you, and they'll say, these young kids today will be saying it about future generations. Are they socialists? No, because look at where they go. These kids who wear the Che Guevara T-shirts, where did they move after college? They moved to Los Angeles, New York, San Francisco, the three most relentlessly capitalist cities on earth. And in Silicon Valley, nearly every company founded dies. The market forces put it out of business. Hollywood is the most meritocratic one of the most meritocratic industries in the world. Wall Street, you're one bad deal or mistrade away from being on the unemployment line. These kids claim they're socialists, but they live like capitalists, and they love creating wealth.
Yeah, and in meantime, what were the boys doing? They were out there cutting grass to earn, $20, and the girls were out there babysitting to earn $20. That's capitalism, right?
Oh, yeah, they love capital. They're not socialists. This is just these complaints about young kids and how they're socialists and they don't care and they're lazy. That's what they say about every generation. Again, it's called progress. It's only in countries where there is no progress that it seems like the kids have a greater work ethic. Well, yeah, they have no choice because they're just trying to survive. Well, in the United States, we've got choice. Thank goodness. And these kids that we think aren't capitalistic, they're going to be the richest part of the richest generation in the history of the richest nation in the history of the world until the generation that follows them, that we denigrate as lazy and spoiled and entitled, eclipses them as the richest generation yet.
Somehow I think, Mr. John Tamny, you and I just wrote the next speech that Trump should be giving, correct?
Yes, he should. Optimism works in this country. And politicians that are optimistic win. Americans persistently believe that their lot in life is going to get better. Remember when George McGovern ran for president in 1972, he talked of the estate tax in impoverished West Virginia, and the voters didn't go for it. Even there, the Americans, because we descend from the crazies who crossed oceans in order to get here, they so badly wanted freedom that they risked their lives crossing oceans. Americans think their life is going to get better. And politicians who just prey on negativity and say the world is awful, I don't think they generally do well. The optimists tend to win. And look throughout history, certainly for president, that's been the case.
Well, I would think that the conservatives, the Republicans, and some libertarians have an awful lot that they can be talking about, but and be on offense, but they're on defense because they don't know how to argue their case, correct?
You're absolutely right. They're constantly saying, oh, no, it's not very unequal in the United States. Look at with all the transfer payments. Oh, no, we're becoming more equal all the time. What are you afraid of? And my favorite one of theirs is they say, hey, well, how can we beat the other side if they're offering free stuff? How can we win that debate? Well, my response to them when they say it is that if you don't think you can beat people offering government handouts, get out of the debate because you're a liability. You don't belong. Because, see, I can beat someone offering government handouts any day of the week 10 times. I could beat them if I'd been starved for a week and hadn't slept for a week. That is the easiest debate of all. Because what the private sector offers is exponentially better than what government can offer. Yet we have so-called conservatives saying, yeah, we can't beat these guys pretending to be Santa Claus. Well, again, get out of the debate. We don't need you. You're the biggest problem for our side.
Ladies and gentlemen, huge round of applause to John Tamny. Watch for his work all over the place as a speechwriter over at Freedom Works and Real Clear Markets. Thank you, Mr. John Tamny, for being with us. And ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way on the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50.
The truth.
The Denise Simon Experience. The Truth Matrix. Vetting, exposing, drilling down to the truth.
Rolling Thunder, this is Hitman. Seat over. Hitman, this is Rolling Thunder. Seat out.
The Denise Simon Experience. Exposing politics, lies, demagoguery, spin, fraud.
Suppress, Mike Charlie, 4 Tree 5, 9er 21, Grid to Mark, Mike Charlie, 47 Tree 9er, 8 9er, out.
Promoting individual situational awareness. Question, probe, notice, ask why.
Mark smoke on the deck, 2 rounds HEPT, gas TOT 5-3. And now, the Denise Simon Experience.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to the Denise Simon Experience. I have with me Lou Paper, who is a very successful author. He is an former adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center. His work is everywhere. I don't know Mr. Paper, but I think he's probably one of the busiest, overachieving men that we'll probably talk to.
You're too kind.
He has just written a book. It's just out, ladies and gentlemen. So, we can go over to Barnes & Noble and Amazon and get the book In the Cauldron, Terror, Tension, and the American Ambassador's Struggle to Avoid Pearl Harbor. Mr. Paper, I'm so excited to read this book. I watched an awful lot of documentaries and whatnot on TV, the American History Channel and, all those kinds of things. And there still was so much to learn about Pearl Harbor. I think you're doing history a big, huge leap here in filling in the blanks.
Well, I hope so.
Well, I think you are. And the timing of your book is very important because we're coming into the holidays and every stocking out there, every tree, every gift should include In the Cauldron. So congratulations on the book.
Well, thank you very much.
Going through documents as you have in order to fill in the blanks here when it came to why was Japan so mad that they decided to attack us on Pearl Harbor, you decided to go a little bit deeper such that I think you got almost, 80 pages of citations in this book. So this, you had to do a lot of legwork for this one, did you not?
I sure did. I had accessed libraries all around the country with various manuscript collections, memoirs, diaries, and things of that nature. And like I say, they're located all over the country, in California, New York, Massachusetts. So the answer to that question is yes.
I would imagine that history teachers and whatnot would be very interested in all things inside the book, In the Cauldron. But most of all, I think surviving families that were part of all things war initiated by the attack on Pearl Harbor would be very interested in this, such that they'd be tapping you on the shoulder and saying, perhaps with even some more questions. Are you prepared for some of those?
I am.
Now, this particular ambassador, did you have some inkling of this ambassador's work? His name was Joseph Grew.
Right.
Did you have some inkling of some of his work that kind of sparked this whole interest on your part?
About 6 years ago, I was thinking of writing a book about America in 1941. It was a pivotal year for the country. Franklin D. Roosevelt had been inaugurated for an unprecedented third term as president. The UAW had signed its first contract with a car manufacturer. The New York Yankees' Joe DiMaggio hit safely in 56 consecutive games. And, of course, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. In the course of my research for that book, I came across the name of Joseph Grew and his effort to orchestrate an agreement to try to avoid the war he saw coming. Joseph Grew, it turned out, was America's ambassador to Japan and had been in that position for almost 10 years.
Wow.
And the more I researched, the more I realized that Grew's story had never been told. And so I switched gears to tell that story. And so that's how I came about to write this book.
We didn't have CIA back then. What did we have, OSS?
Well, I don't even think the OSS was formed during World War II, and it certainly became the predecessor for the CIA. But the CIA, Grew did not have to deal with the OSS or the CIA when he was dealing with Japan from his perch in Tokyo in the months before Pearl Harbor.
He was sending out an awful lot of signals, but nobody was really listening. So that's kind of why I was bringing in the intelligence wing on this. somebody had to have been listening, but just kind of waved them off. Would that be accurate?
Pretty much so. So we can go backwards, but let's just take Pearl Harbor attack itself. So there is no evidence that President Roosevelt and his cabinet knew specifically that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor, but they should not have been surprised that Japan attacked the United States. In November 1941, only a few weeks before Pearl Harbor, Joseph Grew, as the American ambassador to Japan in Tokyo, sent 2 telegrams to Secretary of State Cordell Hull, warning him that that Japan is prepared to launch a suicidal war against the United States, and that armed conflict could come with dangerous and dramatic suddenness. And that was a culmination of Grew's working in Tokyo and his dealings with the Japanese. And I don't think people in Washington, D.C. really took that at face value. They thought Japan might do something in Asia or the Far East, but they did not think that Japan would attack the United States. People thought back in Washington that it would be really stupid for Japan to attack the United States because the United States was so much larger in terms of population and resources. Grew tried, before Pearl Harbor, to disabuse Washington of these notions of what was stupid or not from the Japanese perspective. He kept saying to people in Washington through his telegrams that you cannot assess Japanese thinking by Western standards of logic.
Yes.
And let me take a further step back. So the United States had imposed economic sanctions on Japan in an effort to curb Japan's military aggression in China and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. And those sanctions, by the fall of 1941, those sanctions had crippled the Japanese economy. And Grew knew that a crippled economy in Japan was going to lead to a sense of desperation, and that sense of desperation was going to lead to war. And that's because part of the samurai do-or-die spirit that prevailed in Japan. And Grew knew that for Japanese leaders, it would be better to face annihilation through a suicidal war with the United States than to endure the humiliation of succumbing to American pressure. And he tried to convey that message to people back in Washington, to Roosevelt and Hull, but I don't think they took it at face value.
So the people back in Washington, did anybody take any of these notes or memos or telegrams and trot on over to, say, the Department of the Navy and say, what do you know?
Well, a lot of what Grew sent over, some of what Grew sent over, was shared with the Navy intelligence and the Army intelligence. But again, there too, they all suspected, well, Japan has been engaged in military aggression in China and Southeast Asia. And so it would not surprise them, and they contemplated that Japan would make further moves toward war of some kind or armed conflict of some kind in Asia or for the Far East. But again, they did not think that the Japanese would directly attack the United States for the reasons I mentioned. And in fact, on the morning of December 7, 1941, the Navy admiral who was in charge of the Navy facilities and resources in Pearl Harbor, and the Army general who was in charge of the Army resources and facilities in Pearl Harbor, those two guys at 7:30 in the morning on December 7, 1941, they were about to go play a round of golf.
I thought it was tennis, but golf, okay.
Yeah, it was golf. It was golf. And they were just about to leave when they got word about this attack by Japanese planes on Pearl Harbor.
What did Japan know about our Navy at Pearl Harbor that we should have known that they knew? I mean, were they doing operations, surveillance type operations in and around Hawaii leading up to December 7th?
Well, they were. That's not a focus of my book, but the short answer to your question is yes, they were, and they had spies operating in Pearl Harbor, but it was not much to do because it was a pretty open facility. You did not have to be a spy to see the battleships that were moored in Pearl Harbor. They were open and available for anybody and everybody to see. And Japan had known for a long time that the Pacific Fleet was stationed in Pearl Harbor. And in fact, Roosevelt kept the fleet. It used to be out of San Diego, but he kept, since beginning in May of 1940, he kept the fleet in Pearl Harbor because Roosevelt thought, and he believed, that having the fleet there would deter Japanese aggression, because if the U.S. fleet was there, then it would facilitate their ability to move out into the Western Pacific. And so Roosevelt thought and believed that keeping the fleet there would act as a deterrent. So the Japanese very well knew about the fleet being stationed in Pearl Harbor. And ironically, this is a little footnote, is that the person who planned the Pearl Harbor attack, an admiral named Yamamoto, he happened to be a naval attaché in Washington, D.C. in 1925, when the New York Times ran a first front-page review in its Sunday book review section of a novel by a British journalist who had written a fiction book about a Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. And it's one of those coincidences in history that the admiral who planned Pearl Harbor happened to be in Washington and able to read this book review in the New York Times about an attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor.
There always seems to be some clues out there, don't they? They do exist.
Yes. And so, but even Yamamoto, he was skeptical about what this would mean for Japan, and shortly before, in September, I think it was, 1941, he would tell people a war with so little chance to succeed should not be fought. Because, as I say, the Japanese were going to attack a country that was far larger than they were and had far more resources than they did. And so he knew that the prospect of Japan winning a long, drawn-out war was very small. And that's why they attacked Pearl Harbor. They were hoping that maybe they could inflict a crippling blow on America's military capabilities, and that might give them an advantage and an ability to do some damage and perhaps win a war. But, of course, that didn't succeed.
Hence the term sleeping giant, right?
Right. Well, yeah. That's what they did. They awoke a sleeping giant. The United States was fighting isolationism and domestically. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the Pearl Harbor attack generated a well of anger and determination among the American people. And Roosevelt, who I think was always interested in getting involved in the war more against Hitler in Europe.
Right.
And after Pearl Harbor, Hitler did him a favor, so to speak, by declaring war on the United States shortly after Pearl Harbor.
I'm curious, Mr. Paper, that where we are today, we see some of the same kind of templates here. You apply sanctions against, rogue countries. Some are no longer rogue, some are allies, but nonetheless, we kind of follow that same kind of template, putting the United States in more vulnerable positions to be attacked wherever that may be. It doesn't have to be necessarily on our homeland. I mean, it could be to, other interests that we have or other sovereign locations that we have across the globe. So, as you were writing this, were you kind of overlooking and making some comparisons of 1941 to now?
Yes, absolutely. And there are lessons to be learned from Gru's experience in Pearl Harbor, or his effort to avoid the war in Pearl Harbor, because today you see our government imposing sanctions on North Korea, hoping that it's going to change Kim Jong-un's policies, or in Iran. And I think those sanctions, especially in Iran and even in North Korea, are having an adverse effect on those economies. And the thinking behind it is just like the Roosevelt administration thought. They thought by imposing these sanctions on Japan, it would bring Japan to its knees. And I think there's some of that same thinking going on today. And the fact is, in these countries, money is not everything. It's not always the top priority. And these countries have a culture and a perspective and a way of thinking where sometimes there are other priorities other than money. There's certainly a spirit and pride that these people take, and to think that they will just say, oh, God, things are really bad economically, let's do what the United States wants. I don't think it works that well, and that simply. And I think in a lot of these countries, it may have the opposite effect, as it did in Japan, where it made them more determined to fight for themselves, especially if you have, as in the case of Japan or in the case of these other countries, if you have a very strong belief among the people in an afterlife, a lot of them are prepared to die for their country and for their pride. And so you have to take that into account.
And so is the United States.
Right.
I think by comparison, and tell me if I get this wrong, when you apply sanctions and you try and cripple some adversarial countries, it just kind of like prolongs the pain for everybody. And it's probably only worked perhaps one time, and that was Reagan with the Soviet Union, such that the Soviet Union fell. Did I get that right, or is that just kind of wishful thinking?
Well, I don't pretend to be an expert on the Soviet Union or the circumstances surrounding the collapse of the Soviet Union, but I believe that the Soviet Union had a lot of other problems that were internal and that had nothing to do with the United States. And so they did not have, I don't think the Soviet Union had the internal strength to survive. Remember, the Soviet Union was made up of a lot of different republics. That's where its name came from. And so they had a lot of other issues to deal with that I think contributed to that.
There's an awful lot of lessons to be learned from your book, In the Cauldron. I mean, it was not only from a diplomatic wing, it was kind of from a intelligence warning, symptoms, preparedness. And I would think, and we still keep getting it wrong, we look at the world through American eyes instead of through the eyes of our adversaries.
Well, that's absolutely right. And another component here that contributed to the Japanese decision to launch that attack against Pearl Harbor was the diplomatic side of it. So in the spring of 1941, the Japanese, notwithstanding their do-or-die spirit, did support an initiative to have conversations with Secretary of State Cordell Hull in Washington about a possible agreement that might resolve the two countries' differences.
Right.
But Secretary of State Cordell Hull, he thought there was virtually no chance of there being an agreement between the United States and Japan. He regarded the Japanese as one of the worst international desperados in the history of mankind. And he subscribed to the view that no words of the Japs, as he called them, on paper would be worth anything. But he could not tell that directly to the Japanese. Why? Because in the spring of 1941, the United States military capabilities were woefully inadequate. And so President Roosevelt and the military chiefs told Hull to drag those conversations out with the Japanese as long as possible to give the United States time to bolster its military capabilities and avoid any kind of conflict in the Pacific for which the United States was not prepared. And so that's what Hull did over the course of the spring, the summer, and the fall of 1941. He spent untold hours talking to the Japanese representatives about an agreement that he knew would never come to fruition. And by the fall, by November of 1941, Grew was doing what he should be doing, reporting to Hull that the Japanese were becoming very frustrated about the lack of progress in these discussions. And he said the Japanese were beginning to sense that the United States was really not interested in an agreement, and that the United States was really playing for time, which in fact largely was the case.
That's correct, right.
Except for the fact for Japan, with a crippled economy, for Japan, time was running out. And so Japan said, if we don't strike now, we won't have the resources to support a military fight with the United States. So if we're going to have a fight with the United States, better to do it now than later, because later our resources will be so diminished, we'll be a third-rate power, and we'll have to do whatever the United States demands. And so that, too, contributed to the Japanese decision to launch the war against the attack against Pearl Harbor.
I expect that you're going to have some real historians tapping you on the shoulder here and making some comparisons as such that we're talking about right now. I don't know if they would necessarily come out of the Pentagon, they would come out of the intelligence wing, they would come out of the diplomatic wing, or they would come out of even foreign countries. Because, I mean, your book describes some things that are just, they're playing out in front of us today.
Yes.
It's kind of a scary scenario. I think that you're going to have some interesting responses to this. Have you gotten any so far?
No, the book just came out, so I think a lot of people have not had an opportunity to read it. But hopefully, one of the goals, certainly, in my writing the book, I certainly wanted people to read a piece of history and enjoy it. And if people, whether in government or out of government, can learn something from it, as I think they can, so much the better. So I am hoping that this will give a perspective on Pearl Harbor that people have not focused on, and that it will provide lessons that we can use today.
Well, we've got more tensions today, clearly, than we did in 1941 globally. So your title is apt, In the Cauldron, and that's because of the components of tensions, economies, sanctions, terror factions. I mean, all of these things. Congratulations, Lou Paper, on this book, In the Cauldron.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
A fascinating read, and we appreciate your filling in history for us. I think you've done some justice to an awful lot of people, not just here in the United States, but around the globe. I think I would like to chat with you 6 months from now to see what kind of responses that you're getting. It needs to be on everybody's holiday list. And it can certainly change the conversation around the Thanksgiving dinner table, correct?
Yeah, we hope so.
Okay. Well, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Ladies and gentlemen, there's more coming your way, so stay with us on the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. Thanks, ladies and gentlemen, for staying with us here on the Denise Simon Experience, heard worldwide on Mojo 50. I got the distinct pleasure of having David Rubin with us. He is the author of the book titled Trump and the Jews. David was the former mayor of Shiloh, Israel. He is the founder of the Shiloh Israel Children's Fund to help children that are healing from the traumatic events that in their life is a result of being terror victims. He too was a victim of terror, and so many things to cover. David Rubin, thanks for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience.
Well, you're welcome, Denise. Good to be with you.
I have often said that I think Israel needs to go on about $1 billion. I think they earmark about $1 billion and go on a public relations campaign. Because I think so many people across the world just don't understand all things Israel. But you're kind of helping that with your book, Trump and the Jews. Why did you write that book?
Well, for exactly the reasons that you just mentioned, plus some other reasons. I was watching the election campaign for president, and I saw that President Trump was making some very interesting promises. He was promising to move the American embassy to Jerusalem. He was promising to that he was going to end support for terrorists, and he was making a lot of interesting promises. He was promising to confront Iran and Iran's nuclear program. And I said, well, it's very, very interesting. He seems to really have an understanding of the Middle East. He understood the threat of Islamic terrorism. And not all presidential candidates had done that. Then after he was elected, then the vehemence of the opposition to him was just enormous. It was just overwhelming. Charges of racism and even some charges of anti-Semitism. And I said, wait a second, this doesn't make sense. And at that point, we already saw that he was taking steps to fulfill his promises. And I said, I really have to examine this. I want to do the research and find out also why so many Jews are in the United States are so opposed to President Trump, and to see where, how this plays out and why, it just didn't make sense to me. But then on the other hand, you had other Jews that were very strongly passionate in support, and Israelis who were also very passionately supportive. So I said, I have to examine this. I'm going to research this. And that's how I came up with the book, Trump and the Jews, which examines the Trump presidency, examines President Trump's relationship with the Jewish people, going back a long way since before he was president, and even back to his childhood in New York, and also examines the Jewish community, why American Jews can be so strongly against and so strongly for President Trump, and how it relates to Israel and the entire situation in the Middle East.
Ooh, David, it's about one of the most complicated topics that we have, but it's also often a topic that nobody really wants to talk about, the difference in the Israeli Jews and the American Jews, and how divided they even are here in the United States. I think what Trump did by moving the embassy was something had been festering for quite some time, and previous presidents did not want to necessarily flip that switch and have that done. And Trump was pretty bold in moving that embassy. Now, even there were some in Israel that even opposed that. So where is the division going on, and why is there such a division among Jews on some of these activities and relationships between the United States and Israel? Where is that coming from?
Well, one of the things that I found in researching the book Trump and the Jews is that American Jews are divided based on their connection with their roots. What I've found in the research is that American Jews who came to America mostly in the early part of the 20th century, that's when they started to have an impact in America. They came in poverty, and they worked their way up. They worked hard through education and through hard work to achieve in America. And American Jews are the greatest success story in terms of professional and financial success in the United States, in terms of all the religious groups. However, they are also the religious group that is most disconnected from its heritage. And as a result of that, you have a lot of Jews in America who are extremely successful financially, but I would say, it comes out to about 75% of American Jews that are disconnected from the heritage, that are very assimilated, that are not connected to their religious roots. And as a result of that, when you have that situation, and it never was like that. If you go back a few generations, all of the Jews were connected to their religious heritage and their traditions. But when you have a vacuum, a sudden vacuum that developed over the past few decades, then something always comes in to fill in the vacuum. And what filled in the vacuum for American Jews is knee-jerk liberalism. And sorry to say that, but it's a fact. And you will have American Jews who really don't know about the Bible. They don't know about the Torah. We call it Torah, the Jewish Bible. Mm-hmm. And as I always say, this is the people that received the Ten Commandments from Moses on Mount Sinai and brought it to the world, and that became the foundation for Western civilization in the fully positive sense of it. So it's tragic that so many American Jews are so disconnected from their roots, and that they look to the New York Times as the Bible more than they look to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's the reality.
Yeah. Well, a lot of the same things can be said about Christians. A lot of the same things can be said about the Catholics. So, adhering to a religious doctrine takes discipline, and it takes some education and then some loyalty. And I would say in the last several generations, we've gotten very lazy. And yeah,
lazy and self-centered.
Yes.
Lazy and self-centered.
Yes.
And I think that's a big part of it, because when you're a part of a religious tradition, then you're honoring and respecting something much greater than yourself. And it's not that everything revolves around me. It's what can I do to help other people? It's kind of like what John F. Kennedy said. What can I do? How did the expression go? What can I do for my country?
Mm-hmm.
Not
what can my country do for me? Yeah.
And that's really what it's all about. Now, so American Jews being disconnected from their heritage, and by the way, the research shows that they are more. I'm aware of all the trends, and it goes across religious groups, but it's much stronger in the Jewish community, and that trend towards secularism. So when you are disconnected from your roots as a Jew, then you're also going to be disconnected from Israel, and you're going to care more about issues like gay marriage and what they call abortion rights, even in the 9th month, which is akin to murder, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. But that's the reality. So for that reason, Jews have always have at least in the past couple of decades have always gone for the Democrats in the presidential elections. And what I wanted to do by writing Trump and the Jews is to open up their minds and have them really look at the facts. And if they still choose to vote for Elizabeth Warren or Joe Biden or whoever it might be, well, at least they're doing it based on fact and based on understanding, not based on name calling.
When it comes to anti-Semitism here in the United States, and especially in Europe, it's remarkable to me that the Jewish community isn't out there saying, why can't you guys just leave us alone? We're here working to enhance humanity. We have some successes. We will show you what those successes are, not only in the United States, but in Europe and the Middle East and wherever else. And yet it's almost as though anti-Semitism was a concocted problem. And it was concocted because if you create a false problem, you can put money at it, which is the reason I think that we have, boycott, divest, and sanction, BDS. And it has become yet, I think, another wing of anti-Christian, anti-Semitism channels where there's a lot of money in there. So it's almost like it was born to be corrupt and is corrupt. Is that overstating it, David?
No, I don't think so. I think what the problem that we have today, and yes, I'm aware of all of the BDS, which is, it says to boycott Israel and to deny its existence or its right to exist, and you also have just outright anti-Semitism, mostly coming from the far left today, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
And so you, on one hand you have that, and on the other hand you have the Muslim ideology, the jihadist ideology, and the outright anti-Semitic ideology that is promoted by the Muslim ideologues. And you have those two groups, the fanatical Muslims, working together with the far secular left, and both of them are against Israel. Both of them are against Christians, and they promote their ideology throughout the West, and including the United States, and especially the United States. So, how do you explain that? I mean, the Muslim ideologues believe in hanging homosexuals in the street. The Muslim ideologues believe in a holy war against all of what they call the non-believers, the unbelievers, and on the other hand, you have the far left, which is mostly secular and which believes in just the opposite. So, how do you reconcile that? How do you explain that cooperation? And so, my answer to that is that they are both, in the short-term goals, they have common short-term goals, and their common short-term goal, the primary short-term goal, is to bring down Judeo-Christian civilization. They would like to change the United States. Ultimately, the Muslim ideologues want to turn it into a Muslim nation, and they're not shy about saying that, at least when they speak in Arabic. It's including organizations like CARE, the Council of American Islamic Relations, which sounds very quaint, but actually what they stand for is jihadist Islam, and what they stand for is undoing Western civilization as a Judeo-Christian civilization. And that's also what the far left believes in, because if they believe in Judeo-Christian civilization, then of course they can't believe in gay marriage, and they can't believe in unlimited, free abortions, and because those things are against the Judeo-Christian heritage. So, for the short term, they both want to bring down America as a Judeo-Christian civilization. For the long term, their goals are quite different, and eventually, if they get their wish, they will be at odds and will be in great conflict.
Let's turn over to the Middle East piece between, with Israel. We are trying to have some kind of a peace agreement. I just don't believe that one is ever possible. That's my personal opinion. And yet, there's been an awful lot of offers. There have been some agreements that have been walked away from at the very last minute. And I guess I would think that the Israelis would just say, "Leave us alone. Just leave us alone." We've given up so much, and you guys haven't given up anything. Can there be a peace between all the factions in Israel? Or am I just overreacting?
Well, it depends on what we mean by that.
Yeah, I guess.
If we're talking about Israel, peace within Israel, between the various political parties, the particular different groups of Jews, well, certainly it's possible. If you're talking about peace between Israel and the people who call themselves Palestinians,
mm-hmm.
Then the chances of having peace are very, very slim.
Mm-hmm.
There is a way to a peace agreement, but it has to be a one-way agreement. And I actually wrote about this extensively in one of my previous books, which, by the way, is also available on Amazon.com, and it's called Peace for Peace. And it's also available through my website, DavidRubinIsrael.com. DavidRubinIsrael.com. And you can just find out about any of my books. But in particular, this book, Peace for Peace, spelled P-E-A-C-E, for P-E-A-C-E, which lays out the whole situation. It examines the history of the peace process and why it hasn't worked and how it can work. And the way that it can work is if it's a unilateral peace, which is established by Israel. We're not going to get the people who call ourselves Palestinians
mm-hmm.
to agree
mm-hmm.
to anything reasonable. They want Israel off the map. But there are ways of coming to a peaceful understanding with individual Arabs who happen to live in the land of Israel, and and just want to live their lives peacefully and productively and socially and religiously and with their families, and we have no problem with that. What I do have a problem with is when people want to kill me and take over my country, and that's not something that's going to work. It hasn't worked in the past. The whole Land for Peace formula was a horrible
misguided,
thing that couldn't possibly work, and led to thousands of people wounded in terrorist attacks, including myself and my 3-year-old son, who was shot in the head in a terrorist attack. So this isn't something that could work. What can work, as I said, is a unilateral plan that takes into account those who really do want to live peacefully and who want to respect Israel's sovereignty over its country.
Now, how come, well, do you think there's not enough people here in the United States? Because, I mean, the United States is going to lead the charge in all of these things, especially when it comes to the Middle East. But do you think people here in the United States fully understand all the nuances when it comes to Israel? I mean, when it comes to Jerusalem, when it comes to Palestine, when it comes to Gaza, when it comes to Golan Heights, do they understand all those histories? So they can have some kind of context, or are they just, looking at a headline and going, this is a tired subject and they're indifferent to it anymore?
Oh, no. The American public is not indifferent to Israel and the Middle East. In fact, if they were if they were indifferent to it, then you wouldn't see it in the news all the time.
Mm-hmm.
Israel is a tiny country about the size of New Jersey. And the very fact that we're in the news all the time says that people, says just the opposite, that people actually are very obsessed with Israel, either in a positive way or a negative way.
Mm-hmm.
But look, Israel is a fascinating story, probably the most fascinating story in the history of the world, and the reason why it is such is because we are, as I said earlier, the people who gave the Bible to the world and presented the world with a very moral way of living, and that and we're the only people in the world that has been driven out of its country, exiled around the world, scattered around the world, persecuted, killed by the millions, and then comes back to its little tiny country about the size of New Jersey and reclaims it and builds it up again and turns it into a beacon for the world, that beacon of light for the world. And that is the reality about Israel. Do people around the world really know the facts on the ground about Israel? No. In most cases they don't, and that's why I've written 6 books about it, where I explain everything in a very clear and as concise as possible way, so that people will understand the real story about Israel. And I really want to encourage people to get more information for themselves. They can go to the website, which is David Rubin, Rubin. That's David Rubin, Israel.com. DavidRubinIsrael.com. And they can read a little description about each of my books and get more information. And hopefully once they have the books, then they'll really get a true understanding of what Israel is all about, what the Middle East is all about, and how it affects them as individuals, as Americans or Canadians or whatever, wherever in the world they live.
Is one of the largest missions or targets, if you will, to kind of change minds and put some truths out there, the United Nations? I mean, we've got UNRWA over at the United Nations. We got the Human Rights Council over at the United Nations. It just seems as though you've got members over there that they have to be paid to vote against Israel. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. They're on somebody's payroll, the Palestinians or, Iran or, whoever. But it just seems that if we could just get the United Nations situated the right way, which it's a Herculean task, I might say, then there may be some other, head-turning things that would be in favor of Israel. So is a lot of this problem festering at the United Nations, David?
Well, good luck with that one. The UN is such a cesspool of hatred for Israel, and it's almost if it wasn't so tragic, it would be comical that you have on the United Nations Human Rights Council countries like Cuba and Egypt and there've been at various times countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia and all these countries that don't respect human rights in any way, shape, and form. But most of the time of the UN is expended on condemning Israel and supporting organizations like UNRWA that you mentioned, which hide weapons for terrorists in Gaza. It's just a travesty. To the Trump administration's credit, they have cut off a lot of that funding.
Yes,
and they're the first administration in history that has done so. So at least they're taking a stand. Maybe they could take an even stronger stand, but they are taking a stand against the hypocrisy of the UN. And I think that needs to be done even more.
Yeah, it is one. Nobody wants to write a book, or I don't think I've seen any books written on the stupidness, the corruption at the United Nations. Wouldn't that be a fascinating? I mean, it would have to be an encyclopedia volume for its history, but yet all countries seem to defer big decisions and pacts and agreements over to the United Nations when we all know that it's a stupid thing to start with. So it's kind of like, we'll put it over there to get the blame off of us. Is that about right?
Yeah, that is exactly it. And sometimes there are just decisions that are made based on relations and economics, and the countries at the UN will support other countries that clearly are just against human rights, but they'll do so because they want to have a good relationship with that country, and that's something that's gradually changing at the UN because they realize that the United States is now taking a stand, and they also realize that Israel becoming more of an energy producing nation. Gradually, as with our recent finds in gas, that Israel also has more economic influence, and that's going to change things.
Well, I think one of the bigger friends that Israel had was a U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, and it was a heartbreaker that she resigned. But let's hope that, the traction in the work that she was doing there continues. I would say that.
Well, let me just say, her successor is also doing a fine job.
Good.
Maybe she doesn't get as much publicity, but she's doing a good job as well.
It seems to be, but she's not getting nearly the press that Nikki Haley did. So I'm going to put that burden on you to get some good press out there on that one. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been speaking with David Rubin. His website is davidrubinisrael.com. He's got several books over there that you can buy there, or certainly over at Amazon. Mr. David Rubin, we appreciate the work that you're doing and the attention that you're giving to this. We just hope for something to happen, some kind of light to be lit and to shine on some kind of peace here at some point. But there's so many other channels that are functioning in all of this. Maybe there will be some kind of new successes in the horizon. Thank you, Mr. David Rubin, for being with us on the Denise Simon Experience. Ladies and gentlemen, it's been a pleasure having you with us, and we'll see you again very soon.